I want to preface my story by saying that the names, including my own, places, and films named in the story have been changed to allow me to have my privacy. I hope anyone reading this respects my wishes, and by the end of the story, I think you'll understand. My name is Laura Reynolds. I was once a teenage scream queen, the darling of horror films. But at the age of 30, my star had faded. The bright lights and adoring fans had been replaced by an empty house and forgotten scripts. Ever since my last film, I was a teenage voodoo priest bombed. Something had changed. The reviews were malicious. They said that no longer was she the cute little girl with a blood-curdling scream, but was now a tired woman disillusioned with an industry that chewed her up and spit her out. That review was hurtful, even if it held a merit of truth. I was coming from my most recent audition, another B-movie schlock. It seemed to be all the roles that anyone even entertained to send my way. I know I was better than that. I believe that an actor is only as good as their director, and lately I was getting offers from people that would make Ed Wood look like Stanley Kubrick. The curse of my earlier roles was that no one could look past that darling persona, the innocent victim. I will admit, even my most famous roles were a little more than low-budget horror as well. But the ideas were there, and at the time when stories like mine were all the rage, mine could not be touched. Still, I could use the work, and most of the time I never even had gotten the courtesy of a callback. Finally getting home, the path leading to my house was pitched in darkness. I stumbled heading up to the door and hesitated. I was already upset with myself for the audition, but I was now even more frustrated because I had not left a single light on in the house. I had a weird fear of the dark that sadly never went away from childhood. I was a big girl. I knew it was just what it was, dark. But still, I took my time shuffling into the house. The smell of cigarette smoke still lingered in the doorway, and the objects in my room looked like silhouettes, just staring at me. It is funny how mixing fear in the dark always conjures up monsters from something as simple as a sweater on the back of a chair or a guttural sound coming from a furnace. Something was strange, though, and my neck hairs began to stand on end. I was getting this uncomfortable feeling that someone was standing near me. Gosh, I hate the jitters of being paranoid, I thought to myself. But then, I felt it. A hand started to work its way up my arm and I screamed. The disorienting darkness had taken me off my feet and I landed abruptly on the wood floor of my living room. In a flash, I was blinded by the illumination of my living room lights and I immediately went from fear to anger. It was Bobby standing there. His look of concern was hiding what I can only assume was a belly laugh at my expense. "Bobby!" I shouted. "You know how I feel about that. I feel like I'm about to have a heart attack." Bobby rushed to my side and gently helped me to my feet. His laugh had subsided, and his face told me he knew he had made a mistake. "Aw, babe, I'm sorry. To be honest, I almost didn't go through with it. I was going to back down before you walked in, and I had to make a snap decision. I promise I won't scare you anymore." He proceeded to hand me the prettiest bunch of daffodils. Bobby was sincere, and I know how much he liked an innocent little fright. I couldn't stay mad at him. I knew after my day, I was going to need his attention to help take my mind off that joke of an audition. Despite the hard times, at least I had him. For every failed audition, there was a bouquet of flowers waiting for me with a note of the sweetest and most uplifting words. If he wasn't showering me with praise, he was having me act out his favorite scenes for him while he watched in awe. Truth be told, being with him was the only time I still felt like a star. As I went on, the dream seemed further and further away. I subscribed to a star and director newsletter that would give me my weekly inside scoop on the distant industry. Horror no longer emblazoned the covers, and it designated the back sections with the stupid ads and readers' Q&A. The main article, though, was on this younger director who was sweeping the film industry. It was funny, the magazine called him an overnight sensation that cut through the industry with 3 back-to-back films filmed in France. The funny thing is that they didn't realize that those films had been out in the European market for the better part of 8 years. They were finally beginning to get some traction over here, and the American audience were none the wiser. I was out of my element completely, and I was still well aware. I also happen to be a fan. As I skimmed through the article, I saw he was now trying his hand at horror and was doing auditions through a handful of cities through the Midwest. I saw he was now trying his hand at horror and was doing auditions through a handful of cities throughout the Midwest. I guess he was looking for someone who wasn't a Hollywood type. To my surprise, the next town over was one of his stops. I thought to myself that this was it. If I could work with someone like that, I could finally catch my second win. I now had one more audition coming up, and it had to be the one. I was desperate to get it too. I did not care about what kind of picture it was. I decided it was best if I kept this one to myself. As supportive as Bobby was, I still felt like an utter disappointment whenever I inevitably came home with my tail tucked between my legs. I was fortunate that I had time to prepare for the audition. They weren't starting to cast until later in the year. The next couple of months passed by uneventfully. The stifling, humid heat of summer was replaced by the brisk, haunting air of autumn. It has always been my favorite season. The stifling, humid heat of summer was replaced by the brisk, haunting air of autumn. It has always been my favorite season. During that particularly cold time, strange things started happening. Mysterious notes would appear in my mailbox, written in blood-red ink. The letters were filled with chilling promises of death and whispers of macabre desires. During that particularly cold time, strange things started happening. Mysterious notes would appear in my mailbox, written in blood-red ink. The letters were filled with chilling promises of death and whispers of macabre desires. But the most terrifying part was that the notes contained lines from my own films. Someone was reenacting my darkest moments, imitating the very monsters I had once battled on screen. My mind raced with questions, my heart pounding with dread. Who was behind this torment? What did they want from me? I began to suspect everyone around me, my trust eroded by a relentless fear that was hard to let go. Bobby found the whole situation just silly. He assured me it was just some harmless fan. His demeanor turned to hidden thrills at the discussion of my would-be stalker. I guess, in a way, he related to the person. One fan recognizing another. Why couldn't this one just bring me flowers, though? He did give me a little peace of mind. Maybe it was just some socially awkward fan. Lord knows I had dealt with them numerous times over the years. They just never knew what was an appropriate way to approach someone. But they paid my bills. It was a double-edged sword. It was the middle of October, and all the leaves had browned and patterned down to the winding trails. It was a sound that signaled my favorite time of year. With everything dying, it always brought me to life. The cool and dry days to the chilly, windy nights. It was magical. It was also 3 days before my big audition. Bobby had fortunately gone out of town for a day ago for work, so I wouldn't have to use my acting to lie to him about where I would be this Friday. It really took off the edge of getting ready. I decided I would head into town the next day and buy myself a new outfit for the occasion. The morning arrived like any other. Birds chirping out of my window and the low rumble of garbage trucks making their way down the roads for the early morning pickup. I decided to leave earlier than normal to beat the morning rush hour traffic. Due to the letters being still fresh in my mind, I remained on edge when I was by myself in public. One thing I did not miss about fame was the mob that crowded me every time I set foot in a town square. That day, I missed it just for the security of being surrounded by people. It did make it easier to get a new outfit for my audition, though. There was a cute little boutique shop called Miss Jeans that sat on the edge of town. When I first moved here, it was the closest thing to Hollywood still in my life. It was run by the store's namesake, a sweet old lady named Miss Jean who used to tell people that she created outfits for stars from way back yonder. I don't know if it was true because I had never heard of her in Tinseltown, but I always loved stepping foot into the shop and hearing tales from the bygone era just the same. We would swap stories about our common times in the industry and how much it had changed over the years. Always for the worst, we used to say. Walking into the store, I hardly recognized it. Although there was one dusty photo left of a young Ricky Nelson, it was doing a terrible job of covering up a hole in the wall. I shook my head in disgust. I approached one of the ladies walking around, hanging her overpriced glittery tops on a display mannequin, and politely asked where Miss Jean was. It was unfortunate to hear her say that Miss Jean had passed away 2 years ago and that the shop had been bought by a corporation that was wanting to cater to today's youth. It seemed the older I got, the more the days of old were buried. I'm glad that we had it so much better than the kids today. Although a lot of times it felt like a curse. A distant memory that was long gone and yet lingered around like a dead body. I wanted to shop somewhere else that was a little more my style, but I was starting to run low on time. I needed to find something and then get back to prepare. While trying on a handful of outfits, I could not shake this feeling that I was being watched. Not by a clerk who was half on the prowl for shoplifters, but someone watching me in particular. I scanned the room and couldn't find anyone out of the ordinary. Just a few moms and their daughters looking for that one outfit for the school dance or homecoming or whatever else the kids were going to. Still, I remained on edge. It was still fairly recent that I had gotten those letters, and harmless fan or not, I did not want to have an altercation in regards to it. I picked out a particular dress that I am convinced was part of Miss Jean's old stock. Everything about it screamed star to me when I wore it. It looked just like something Ava Gardner would have worn to the premiere of The Sentinel. And as I walked out of the dressing room, a car whizzed by and lit up the dress. It reminded me of the paparazzi's camera flash. I felt it was a good sign and knew I had found my outfit. I went up to the counter and made a great effort to get the cashier's attention to ring me out. There was a struggle watching her walk over to push 3 buttons on her cash machine. Out of nowhere, a boom rang throughout the store, loud enough to make the girls scream in unison. The loud crash had startled me as well, and I nearly dropped my purse in fright. I turned around in an instant to see what it was, and it ended up being the front door had been pulled open, clapping off the glass and making a thud that would have given anyone with shell shock a knock back into war. "Must have been the wind," I could hear one of the mothers mutter to her little one. It's funny, but I remembered it being quite peaceful outdoors today, and when I had gone outside to leave the store, if there was any wind, it left just as fast as it came. I got into my car and started to head out. Between the paranoia in the store and that door, I had already had too much excitement for one day, and now would just have to relax a little before my big night. Pulling into my driveway, I saw it was about noon when I got home. I started my way down the stepping stones leading to the front door when I remembered I hadn't grabbed the mail. Heading toward the box and passing the overgrown weeds in my yard, amongst the weekly dose of junk mail and coupons, I found one new letter. This one was different from the others. It did not contain a quote, but a message for me. In a scrawled and crude writing, all it said was, "Good luck with your audition. Should be a real killer. P.S. Love the new dress." How in the world could this person know about my audition or where I was? This had now gone too far. I no longer felt safe, and if this person knew about this, then they must have been watching me in the house and following me in town. No one could have known about the audition. I needed to report this to the police, but time was not on my side. I now had to get ready for my audition. Was it foolish of me that that was my priority? Perhaps. But I also knew I would not get another shot. The letter would still be there afterwards anyway for me to take to the station. It was now 3 p.m. when I left, but it was already getting dark. The golden hour of early sunset was painting the sky an orange hue and was blinding me in my rearview mirror. The closer I got to the venue, the harder it became for me to rationalize what I was doing. I had someone actively watching me. Was this that important? Before I knew it, I was sitting outside the venue with 3 deep breaths. I made my decision. The stage, and then the police. I walked into the crowded hallway, outside the room where sat the director of my next rejection. My mind was wandering off into the distance. As important as this was, I could not shake the fear out of my mind. My lips were trembling, and the shivers kept involuntarily shaking my body no matter how hard I fought against them. Just then, a voice broke through the walls of deep thought. It was the casting director signaling me back in. I snapped to, smiled, and then followed him to the back room. Walking into the room, I saw 3 people sitting in chairs before me. The director I recognized immediately from the director newsletter. He was gaunt and in his own world had an air of pretentiousness about him, but it was well earned. He had recently received many accolades for a 3-part period piece at foreign film fests. I knew he was making waves across seas and was looking to make his big break into Hollywood. She couldn't have looked more disinterested in the whole procedure. She didn't seem like the horror type and was more than likely there to support her golden egg of a director. Lastly, there was the man who would no doubt be reading with me. The young director looked up to greet me, and I could tell immediately he knew who I was. The arrogance in his persona flew out the window, and he melted into a fanboy before me. He told me how when he was 9, his parents had taken him to see Stalkers in the Night, one of my first films, and was shaken for days at the portrayal of the killer and my girl that got away. I told him how we had initially wanted Sinatra to play the killer for the play on words, but he was never even remotely close within our budget, and how we had found great success with a sound-alike the casting director found in a local bar near the set. It was one of those films that have stood the test of time since the parody song has become somewhat of a Halloween tradition, like Monster Mash. Although nowadays, people have no idea that the song originated in our movie. The director laughed heartily at this. He found great joy in the story and was happy to have a new piece of trivia regarding one of his favorite films. As flattered as I was, I had heard these lines before. Not just from fans, but also from the directors who, after all the praise, still rejected me. Audition after audition. He brought me over to read with the young man sitting down. But reading over the script, I found parallels with my own situation. It was an older woman, not some young girl, and she was being terrorized by a hidden assailant who followed her every move. The more I read, the more I started to feel the fear creep back up. Reality snapped in, and I realized I was still dealing with the most terrifying event of my life. I stumbled my lines, not from forgetting, but because my lips would not stop trembling. I was so scared. I began to tear up as I pushed through the words. The director and actor sat in silence. Even the board producer had her head up watching me. After making a complete and utter fool of myself, I apologized to them and began to leave. I tried to find the door I had entered and felt a hand placed on my shoulder. I let out a small shriek. It was the director. He had been calling out my name, but in my hysteria, I had blocked out all the noise and had inadvertently ignored him. He stopped me from leaving. He had to tell me that what he saw floored him. Not only was it the standout performance, but it was the most realistic interpretation of fear he ever saw. He said I would be hearing from him soon, and that when I did, I would have to tell him the methods of my craft. He had no idea it wasn't an act. I was blindsided by this. My look of terror turned into a look of both surprise and excitement. He then shook my hand and bid his farewell. I thought that I actually won a role in not just some B movie, but a real opportunity for a comeback. This was a real director, an artist, about to make his mark on the world of cinema, and he would want me along for the ride into familiar territory. I was so overwhelmed with excitement that I completely shrugged off the police station. After all, it was probably just a harmless fan who had gotten a little clingy. I started to head straight home. As I returned home from the audition, I noticed that all the lights were off in my house. I always left on a light, especially if I were to come home after dark. But with the dusk coming earlier and earlier, it must have slipped my mind. Still, I started to feel the early onset feeling of anxiety kicking in as I made my way up the darkened porch steps. I fumbled in the dark, taking baby steps forward so as to not trip on anything and brushing my hand over the walls looking for the switch. I couldn't help but to feel a little uneasy. I hated the dark and the illusions it would bring. I turned my head towards the next room and I noticed there was a light emanating from the kitchen. The kitchen was shrouded in darkness, save for a single spotlight illuminating a figure standing in the center of the room. It was my boyfriend, Bobby. Only he was dressed in all black, his arms folded behind his back. "Bobby! Bobby!" I cried out. I breathed a sigh of relief. "I thought you were out of town. Why are you dressed like that?" A devious grin cut across Bobby's face when he asked me, "How was your audition? Was it to die for?" I paused for a moment to fathom what I was hearing, and then my eyes widened in shock. It felt like the walls were twisting and turning around this morbid figure of what looked like Bobby. At first, I couldn't believe it. Bobby, the one person I thought I could always count on, who worshipped the ground I walked on, was the one orchestrating this terrifying charade. His eyes gleamed with excitement as he looked at me, and I could tell he could hardly contain himself, as if everything he had done had led to this moment. As long as I live, I will never forget the words he spoke to me that night. "I've always adored your characters, Laura," he confessed, his voice chillingly calm. "But we both know that your character was only as good as the monster that plagued her, and lately your monster has been life. And let's be honest, it's scary and depressing, but it doesn't make for a good villain. You needed a more traditional monster, and I want to help you give the performance of a lifetime." My heart sank as his words echoed through the room. I had unknowingly fueled his obsession, and now it threatened to consume me. His arms, slowly unfolding from behind his back, were now displaying a knife and monstrous mask. I immediately recognized it from one of my films, and when he put the mask on, the air in the room turned blistering cold, even though I was sweating. Just then, Bobby made his move towards me. Bobby began chasing me around the house, wielding that crude old knife. The blood in my veins was ice cold, and the trembling in my hands was violent. The terror I felt froze me in place, and all I could do was hide. I felt my death was imminent. Hiding in the closet, I could hear Bobby's heavy breathing from excitement. In the seams of the closet door, I could make out his figure. He was wearing that grotesque mask worn by the killer in Terror Night, my first film, and was hunched over like a lurking beast in the shade of night. He was a man possessed. No longer was he my love, but a monster from the films I encapsulated. If I did not do something, I knew I would not survive the night. I had to fight back, to summon the courage that had once made me a beloved figure on the silver screen. But I didn't know how. Bobby was a lot bigger than me and was armed to boot. Any wrong move would surely place my life on the line. But I knew something he didn't. When filming that movie in particular, I remember Webb, the stuntman, having to rest during one take from smashing his head on the wall. The heavy jumpsuit was a sauna that drenched his body and made him careless, and the mask limited his vision and made it exceptionally difficult to catch his breath. Knowing this, and with a burst of adrenaline as he walked past the closest door, I lunged at him, desperately hoping to gain the upper hand. The struggle was fierce, the battle between the one who wanted to live and the one who desired to kill. The attack caught him off guard, and I was able to get him off his feet. Luckily for me, the mask he had worn had labored his breathing just as I thought. The one part they never elaborate on about the killers in the movies. Finally, I caught a break, and Bobby's narrow vision caused him to miss his slash with the knife. As his hand hit the floor, the knife flung out of his hand and slid across the floor, just within my reach. With trembling hands, I grabbed it and fought back, stabbing Bobby several times in the chest. Bobby was too fatigued to fight back. It looked nothing like the movies. You could stab a body 100 times in the films and it will still look like it was gently sleeping. Bobby was bathed in the pool of blood that had seeped from his mortal wounds, and his death throes had not stopped. The horror in his eyes mirrored my own as his obsession finally consumed him. He mustered his remaining strength to pull off the mask. I could see his life fading before me. He looked at me and smiled, but it was the smile of the Bobby I knew. In a weakened tone, he said only one word. "Bravo. Bravo." Before he could say more, I slammed the mask back on his head. Before he could say more, I slammed the mask back on his head. He did not deserve to talk to me anymore. I sat down and caught my breath. My eyes welled up and I began to weep at events that unfolded that terrible night. I never saw the signs, and even if I did, I could have never thought it would have been him. Through my tears, I turned towards the body. I always remembered in my movies, the monster always gets up one more time. But Bobby lay there motionless. His skin turned pale white from the loss of blood. Bobby would have been so disappointed in himself for not going through with the final scare. At last, I was free. But the scars of that night remained etched in my mind. The illusion of the bright lights and fame had faded, replaced by a deep-rooted fear and a sense of loss. I emerged as a changed person, forever haunted by my real-life monster. After that night, in a twist of fate, my mailbox was flooded with offers from studios. It would seem that I would be back on top. The audition I had recently gone to was blowing up my phone as well. Finally, after some healing, I was able to call them back and respectfully decline their offer. They respected my decision, but were perplexed as to why I could turn down the role that would put me back in the limelight. The irony is, after that night, I no longer wished to be the star or seek that next role. Because that night, I played the most important role of my life. A survivor. Hello everyone, I'm Giggles, and thank you so much for listening to my narration. A quick shout out to all my patrons: Melissa Perez, Geek Sanctuary, Lawrence Wallen, Andreas Anderson London, Eric Cifuentes, Krzysztof Kozak-Slazak, Jesse Hartley, and Icy Narrates. If you want to become a patron today, you can check out the link in my description below. And as always, thank you so much for your support. I'll see you in the next video.